My name is Ginger Campbell, and my show is Brain Science, which I launched back in 2006. The show is really driven by one goal, which is to explore how neuroscience is unraveling the mystery of how our brains make us human. And my show's tagline is the show for everyone who has a brain, because my goal is to make neuroscience accessible to everyone. And it's annoying how many times people say to me, well, I can't listen to your show because I don't have a brain. That's my least favorite bad joke. But I've entitled this talk, Why Neuroscience Matters, because over the years I've developed this philosophy that I really think neuroscience literacy ought to be part of basic science literacy in the 21st century. I'd argue that neuroscience could be the ideal gateway to science because it's a good way of teaching people how science really works. So I'm going to share today a few examples of the practical usefulness of neuroscience, and then also try to give an example that shows how you can show with neuroscience how science is done. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about memory. This is, and it really dovetails nicely with the memory palace. If you guys heard, I was thinking how well his talk sort of jives with mine. Anyway, people have gotten Nobel Prizes for figuring out what's happening at the molecular level, but the average person still thinks that memory works kind of like a videotape that you play back and it's the same every time. I mean, you guys don't think that, but that's what most people think. The reality is memory is very unreliable, and there are important reasons why. It turns out every time we recall a memory, it's actually dynamically recreated. And that means it includes things that have happened or that we've learned since the original event occurred. But that becomes melded into the memory just as if it was part of the original event. Earlier this year, in episode 141, I interviewed Dr. Rodrigo Quiroga, who's the author of The Forgetting Machine, Memory Perception, and the Jennifer Aniston Neuron. I have slides, but this room really turned out to be not too slide friendly, but I only had 6 slides, so you're not missing anything. Anyway, this book's an excellent introduction to important principles about perception and memory. And the reason for the main title, The Forgetting Machine, is to emphasize that we don't remember things in exact detail because our brain's priority is actually meaning rather than details. In fact, if you have total recall, it's actually very disabling, and this has been proven by several famous case studies that people could remember everything. Kind of a, you can't see the forest for the trees kind of problem. People who can remember every little detail can't figure out what's important. They can't even tell you what the gist of the story is because they're so overwhelmed by detail. So we talked about the discovery of the so-called Jennifer Aniston neuron, which Quiroga prefers to call the concept neuron. These neurons, interestingly enough, they responded not only to Jennifer Aniston, but also to Lisa Kudrow, but not to other people from the show Friends. I mean, because in the middle of the interview I said, well, why do we call it the Friends neuron? And he said, because they didn't respond to the other people on the show. And they found other neurons that responded to characters from Star Wars. So a few key things about these neurons. First, they're located in the hippocampus, which you probably know is associated with memory. Also, they're multimodal, which means that they responded not only to seeing a picture of Jennifer Aniston, but also hearing her name. And probably most importantly, they demonstrated plasticity. They found neurons, not the same ones that responded to Jennifer Aniston, but other neurons in the hippocampus that could learn to recognize people who worked in the lab. And this happened in a period of less than a week. Because these experiments were done on people that were having pre-op recordings done before epilepsy surgery. Quiroga lamented that the media hype surrounding his discovery actually derailed his career for a while because he had difficulty being taken seriously within the scientific community. Naturally, there were people who were put off by the oversimplification of his discovery, and the unfortunate side effect is that probably the larger implications of his work were lost. For example, it's usually assumed that the hippocampus is important for formations of memory. But the discovery that there are these highly specific multimodal neurons implies that the hippocampus might actually have a role in memory recall. So that's a very interesting thought that hasn't really been pursued yet. Another take-home point brings us back to, of that interview, takes us back to my original point, which is that memories are going to be recreated every time they're recalled, and they're surprisingly unreliable. Elizabeth Loftus, you may have heard of her work, she's demonstrated that it's incredibly easy to create false memories. And the significance of this is very far-reaching. She's shown that the accuracy of eyewitness testimony is affected not only by how questions are asked, but who the witnesses talk to. So it turns out the most accurate testimony is probably the first testimony that's obtained before the witness talks to anyone else. But that's not what we hear. I mean, that's not what the jurors hear in court. And to think about it as how it works in your daily life, have you ever had a disagreement with somebody because you remember an event differently than they do? Like my sister and I would talk about our childhood, and sometimes I'm not sure we had the same childhood. People get into these long-running feuds that have origins in disagreements about the two people remembering events differently. The problem is that, or one problem, is that we usually feel really certain that our memory's right. And we assume that because there's this, or it's often assumed that because there's a high emotional content to the memory, that makes it more accurate. But the work of Loftus and others has shown that neither one of these is a reliable indicator. Certainty or emotional content is a reliable indicator of the accuracy. This was demonstrated wonderfully in a book I read called by Robert Burton called On Being Certain, Believing You Are Right Even When You're Not, who I interviewed way back in like 2008. He described the study that was done at the time of the Challenger disaster by a psychologist, Ulrich Neisser. Neisser was studying something called flashbulb memories. That's memories for dramatic events like 9/11. So what he did was, within a day of the Challenger disaster, he asked 106 psychology students, famous subject of psychology experiments, to write down how they found out about the Challenger disaster, where they were, what they were doing, what they felt. And then they were interviewed again 2.5 years later. And this is a famous paper you can look up if you want to see the details. Anyway, 25% of them gave accounts that were markedly different from what they originally wrote down. More than half of them made errors, and less than 10% of them actually got all the details the same as they originally wrote down. In fact, the most surprising thing was how certain they were about their memories, even when they were confronted with their original journal entries. There was this one student who actually said, that's my handwriting, but that's not what happened. So no matter how much neuroscientists discover about the mechanisms of memory, it's not going to change the fact that our memories aren't as reliable as we want to believe. And that brings me to the second idea that I want to share today.
Could I interrupt you with a question on what you just said?
Okay.
Quickly, I've been a newspaper reporter at long intervals of my life, and I've discovered the rule that you don't remember what you saw, you do remember what you wrote down. And you ask about it later, you remember what you wrote down, not what a film or something would show. But are you saying people misremembered what they wrote down, or misremembered what they saw about the Challenger?
I think the answer is hard because I'm not sure how the question was asked. I'm not sure that they were asked, what did you write down? I think they were asked what they remembered. Okay? What they wrote down was used to represent the most accurate account of what happened because they had written it down right when it happened. Now you could argue maybe even that wasn't accurate, but the point was that between the time when they wrote down these things and 2.5 years later, their memory changed. So the second key idea that I want to share is that most of what our brain does is outside of our conscious awareness. And I hesitate to use the term unconscious because that brings up, Freudian ideas like the idea that you can suppress your memories into your so-called subconscious. Now, Freud was right that a lot of important stuff goes on outside our conscious awareness, but most of his ideas don't stand up to scientific scrutiny. But they persist in our culture because most people, basic neuroscience literacy is not a given. You can still read in reputable journals like National Geographic that we only use 10% of our brain. That's one of my pet peeves.
And that's not true.
No, it's not true.
What's the percentage?
100%.
We use it all for something.
So I will come back to that when we get done, okay? So once you learn, let's just go back to the unconscious part for a minute. So let's say a lot of what our brain does is unconscious, if we want to use that word. It has a lot of implications. You learn a complex task and then it becomes automatic. This makes it possible for us to learn really complex skills. Can you imagine how stressful it would be if it was still as hard to drive a car as it was when you were learning? Sure, everyone remembers learning how to drive a car. The great thing about driving a car is it's an automatic thing that we still remember as opposed to something like learning how to walk, which none of us remember. So that's an example of a once conscious task that's become automated or unconscious. The ironic thing is that these sorts of things, once they become learned, performance can actually be impaired by thinking about it. And sports gives us a lot of examples of this. When athletes try to think about how to do something like shoot a foul shot, they can't do it anymore. Now, that's just one example. That's something that was conscious that became automated. Now, there's lots of stuff our brain does that's never conscious and we never have access to it. And Burton provides a lot of examples in his writing, but one that I find really striking is what he calls the feeling of certainty, which I kind of alluded to a few minutes ago. That's the feeling that you have when you're sure about something, okay? Where does that come from? He argues that it comes from outside our conscious awareness. Well, you might say, well, why does this feeling of certainty exist? Well, consider the survival benefit of being able to commit to a certain course of action. You probably know someone who can never make up their mind about anything. Those are the kind of people that drive us crazy because most of us take this feeling of certainty for granted. I'll give you some examples, one of which is going to be sort of silly. Let's say that you have decided that you're going to go out to eat dinner with a friend. And they probably will ask, well, what do you want to have? And usually your response is either you're in the mood for something, so I'm in the mood for Mexican, or you're not in the mood for anything, so you get them to choose, right? But as soon as they choose something, you're either going to go, okay, that's fine, or no, I'm not in the mood for that. Even though you were never thinking about that thing before, but as soon as they bring it up, you have an opinion, right? Now that's not very interesting, but it's a good example of how ubiquitous this process is. I mean, you don't ask yourself, well, am I really sure that I'm in the mood for Mexican food? You just know you are or you aren't. Now, consider another scenario. Let's say you're trying to decide whether to take a new job. And you make a list of all the pros and cons, but you still can't make up your mind. What do most people do? They say, okay, I'm going to sleep on it, right? And then they wake up the next morning, and usually the next morning they have some clarity. Oh, I know that I'm going to take the job or I'm not going to take the job. And they feel certain about it. And why? Well, he argues, Burton that is, that while we're asleep, our brain is continuing to process the information, so when we wake up, we have a choice. It seems as if by magic, which is why that's the point at which people will say, you know, that they got the answer from a higher power or their muse or whatever, you know, thing that their belief system fits. Speaking of beliefs, this is another example of something that we can't access or control consciously. And I think that this is a really important concept. Two people can listen to the same information and draw different conclusions. Now, hopefully you're familiar with the principle that correlation does not equal causation. But the reality is that since scientists are human, sometimes one person's correlation is another person's causation. In science, these debates are settled when a consensus is reached that enough evidence for causation has been established. But outside science, there are issues that can't be resolved this way. For example, evolution is a very well-established scientific theory. But science can't prove or disprove the existence of God. Yet almost everyone feels pretty certain about the issue, one way or the other. The point I want to make is the fact that you feel certain, one way or the other, doesn't constitute evidence that you're right. Now, when we understand that we don't consciously choose our beliefs, and this is opposing a book I had recently that said, choose what you believe, but I don't think that fits the neuroscience, it ought to, or I would hope, promote humility and compassion, which are two qualities that are sorely missing in today's world. Another reason why it's useful to understand that beliefs are not consciously chosen is that it explains why facts never seem to change people's minds, which you have probably experienced. So one thing I want to emphasize about the fact that much of what our brain does is outside of our conscious awareness is that this does not rob us of our personal freedom or our responsibility. Assuming your brain's functioning correctly, you are constantly making conscious decisions that will influence your future choices and behavior. And whatever your age, though I think if you're younger, the consequences of your choices are going to be greater, it's going to influence you. So are you learning skills that are going to help you flourish in the future? Are you developing the habits that reflect the kind of person you want to be? Each of us has to choose how we react to the world around us, but over time, those reactions become automatic. On a more positive note, if we remain active and curious, there is evidence that provides us some protection against dementia in our later years. So I consider the unreliability of memory and the fact that much of what our brains does is unconscious, two things that most people don't know, to be two basic facts every educated citizen should know. Okay. So now I'm going to give you a little bit of basic science, just because it's cool, and I'm sure that some of you are probably wanting to have something a little bit more meaty than what I've talked about so far. So on brain science, I usually interview scientists and philosophers who've written books. I do this because it makes it easy for my listeners to learn more about any topic that they find interesting. However, I just did my 4th interview with Dr. Seth Grant because his work's really fascinating and he's a really good science communicator. He's actually a molecular biologist in the UK. As a postdoc, he worked in Eric Kandel's lab, and he spent decades studying the synapse. And he's made some surprising discoveries that I am going to share with you briefly. So he started out trying to figure out what all the proteins are in the synapse of a wide variety of organisms. And the first interesting thing that he discovered was that some of these proteins are actually date back to the cell membranes of unicellular or single-cell organisms. Molecules like dopamine, and almost everyone's heard of dopamine, actually are literally millions of years old. The next came a really, I think at the time, big surprise, which was that all synapses are not the same. Now, it's an assumption that the synapse is a synapse is a synapse. But Grant's work shows that this assumption is false. It turns out that as organisms become more complex, their synapses become more complex. An important turning point was during the Cambrian explosion when the genome was duplicated twice, which is actually what allowed vertebrates to evolve to be more complex than invertebrates. Some really great things about molecular biology is that it's revealed this thing about the genome duplicating, which answers the question of, well, how did they happen? Anyway, so at that same time, the synapse becomes more complex, which is really interesting because it means that the synapse became more complex before brains became more complex. So it's really, kind of mind-blowing if you're familiar with the usual way of looking at, what makes animals smart. Grant's ultimate interest is in understanding mental illnesses and learning disabilities that have a genetic basis. And he's made great strides by showing how single gene mutations can affect learning in mice. The reason that this is important is that we share lots of genes with mice, and he makes these changes in genes that exist in mice and people. These are genes that we know are associated with diseases like schizophrenia. So what he does is he makes these genetic changes in mice and shows that just one gene, changing one protein, can affect learning, which is pretty mind-blowing. And in our most recent conversation, which I posted last week, he describes the first whole mouse brain synaptome, which is a mapping of the synapses across the brain, basically using the green fluorescent protein to label two of the major protein complexes in the synapse and then see how they distribute across the brain. And what they discovered was incredible diversity. It actually implies that it may be that every synapse in the brain is unique, which is a long way away from every synapse is the same. And this has a lot of implications for things about synapse function, especially with regard to perception and memory. I mean, it may actually be that this synapse complexity is a part of how memory is stored. So it's really fascinating. And in the interview, he talks about how it's not like we're going to throw away the old theories or throw away what we know about long-term potentiation or any of that, but it's sort of a complementary way of looking at it.